cannot flourish with the unchecked, unfettered, illegal immigration that is Biden's border invasion. Through this hearing today, I intend to give the American workforce a voice by holding Democrats accountable for their disastrous open border policies. There's never been a country more welcoming to immigrants than America. Our legal immigration process has allowed millions of immigrants to achieve the American dream for their families, approximately 1 million per year on average. Our country has a unique American identity, a fact that is upheld and reinforced with a robust, merit-based citizenship process and a respect for the rule of law. Under President Biden, American jobs are threatened. Illegal aliens are competing against Americans for American jobs. Illegal workers provide many advantages for some employers since they cost $0 additional dollars in taxes and often accept lower wages for more work. American taxpayer dollars are also at stake. Americans pay for each border crossing, whether it's through government-purchased iPhones, stays in 4-star New York City hotels, or $450,000 monetary settlements, all of which are happening as part of the Democrat plan to incentivize more mass illegal immigration. These expenditures are in addition to the commonly accepted costs that illegal aliens impose on American society by participation in our education and healthcare systems. And overall, illegal immigration is estimated to cost taxpayers $150.7 billion per year. Real wages for the working class have collapsed thanks to the policies of the Biden administration. Under President Trump, blue-collar real wages rose 5.6%. Under Biden, blue-collar real wages have fallen 2.1%. Bidenflation is largely responsible for the economic hardship middle-class Americans are dealing with. Additionally, the decline of blue-collar wages is significantly affected by 7 million illegal aliens pouring across the border during this administration. Liberal Democrats used to recognize the depressing effect of illegal immigration on American wages. Bill Clinton constructed portions of the border wall in an attempt to curb illegal immigration during his time in office. The Obama-Biden administration built over 100 miles of border wall during its tenure. Where are those liberal ideas now? Why has the other side completely abandoned all hope of making our border secure? Why the Democrat Party has decided to turn its back on American working class and taxpayers is the political question of our time. I don't expect to answer it with today's hearing, but I do hope to explain some of the dire economic consequences of Democrat policies for our rapidly transforming country. With that, I look forward to the hearing today, and I yield to the ranking member, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be back here after spending time in our districts. While I hope we can have a productive and respectful discussion today, I would be remiss if I did not note that this hearing will focus on issues related to immigration and border security, both of which are outside the subcommittee's jurisdiction. As members of this subcommittee, our job is to uphold and create legislation that benefits the American workforce. For the vast majority of Americans, earning a paycheck is how families are able to pay their bills. Since the 1970s, however, the highest income households in America have pulled ahead further and further, and even more dramatically after COVID, than average working families. This is the problem of economic stagnation in America, is the extreme concentration of greed and wealth in this country, not immigration. The Congressional Budget Office shows that between 1989 and 2019, the total wealth held by families in the top 10% increased by 240%, while the other 90% barely increased at all. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that we are using our time here today to talk in dangerous rhetoric that fuels racial and prejudice conspiracy theories rather than focus on the important, extremely important work for American families and the workforce. By contrast, the Biden administration and congressional Democrats have made our priorities crystal clear. We have priorities that prioritize that the needs of workers and their families are delivered in meaningful solutions to grow our economy from the bottom up and the middle out. Last Congress, Democrats passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which invested in our workforce and the economy while lowering costs for working families. Moreover, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, families are saving on energy bills and prescription drug costs, thus giving them more purchasing power. Additionally, the American Rescue Plan provided a solution to the multi-employer pension crisis, saving the pensions of over 1 million workers and preventing the closure of thousands of businesses. Today's hearing is also happening as we race closer to the deadline to fund the federal government, an obligation I know we all take seriously as members of Congress, or I hope we do. Regrettably, once again, we find ourselves in a precarious situation with some in the majority threatening to hold our economy hostage and risk a government shutdown unless they pass cruel and regressive immigration policies, severely weakening critical federal programs and protect workers. I'm unaware of anyone who believes in open borders other than the marketing people by a small percentage of the majority party, I hope. Research by the Joint Economic Committee confirms that these dangerous tactics only lower consumer confidence, reduce economic output, and interrupt essential government operations, including federal employee pay. It is important to note that the last 3 government shutdowns cost the government at least $338 million in additional processing costs and late fees. Also, Fitch Ratings downgraded the U.S. credit rating for the exact type of brinkmanship on the debt ceiling. Instead of wasting time on political games, it's my hope that the congressional Republicans and caucus and Democrats, we can join together, as we have historically in the past, in backing legislation that builds on our unprecedented economic development while also ensuring American workers have access to fair pay, adequate benefits, and workplace safety. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which will repair and upgrade old infrastructure around the country, as well as the CHIPS and Science Act, which will further boost our economy and revive our manufacturing workforce, are examples of what can happen when we move past the divisive rhetoric and focus on what matters most to those we serve. As we enter the next legislative session, let us put politics aside and focus on improving the lives of American workers and their families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you to our ranking member. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements in the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 o'clock today. By 5 o'clock, 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is September 27, 2023. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous materials referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I will now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Robert Law, who is the Director of the Center for Homeland Security and Immigration at the American First Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Our second witness is Dr. Stephen Camarata, who is the Director of Research at the Center for Immigration Studies in Washington, D.C. Our third witness is Mr. Daniel Costa, who's the Director of Immigration Law and Policy Research at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Our final witness is Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who is the President of the American Action Forum in Washington, D.C., and is here testifying on his own behalf. So I thank all of our witnesses for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, I'd ask that you each limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. And I'd also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. And I will first recognize Mr. Law for your statement.
Thank you, Chairman Good and Ranking Member DeSaulnier, for the opportunity to testify on the harmful impact the Biden administration's open border policies have on the American workforce. Since taking office, the Biden administration has systematically and purposefully dismantled the securest border in our nation's history. Over the objections of career Department of Homeland Security officials, the Biden administration stopped building the border wall, ended the revolutionary migrant protection protocols, or Remain in Mexico policy, canceled the asylum cooperative agreements with the Northern Triangle countries, and nullified interior enforcement. As a result of this failed border strategy, more than 5 million illegal aliens have been allowed into American communities in just 30 months. Migrant children are being trafficked at record levels, and fentanyl, which is smuggled across the southern border, is now the leading killer of young Americans aged 18 to 45. By abandoning the previous administration's America First policies, the Biden administration has ceded operational control of the southern border to the Mexican drug cartels. DHS's nationwide catch and release scheme encourages millions of illegal aliens to be trafficked and smuggled to the southern border and released into the U.S. This is a crisis by design. It has made every state a border state, and it is unsustainable. Don't just take my word for it. Sanctuary City Mayor Eric Adams said illegal aliens will, quote, destroy New York City, end quote, the largest U.S. city. Another Sanctuary City Mayor, Brandon Johnson, echoed that alarm, quote, let me state this clearly. The city of Chicago cannot go on welcoming new arrivals safely and capably without significant support in immigration policy changes, end quote. Outrageously, instead of introducing deterrence policies, DHS is conducting an unprecedented outreach campaign encouraging illegal aliens to apply for work permits to assuage fellow Democrats who have started to criticize the administration's broken immigration policies. As a result of this labor market distortion, more and more Americans have fewer and fewer jobs available. Many might be surprised to learn that illegal aliens are able to get work permits despite being in the country unlawfully. Briefly, here are the primary ways the Biden administration is getting illegal aliens into the workforce to the detriment of American workers. 1, fraudulent asylum claims to obtain a work permit. Nearly every illegal alien apprehended at the southern border claims asylum to prevent being quickly deported. Yet, no more than 10 to 15% of them actually qualify for asylum, a fact that this administration is well aware of. But because of the surge of claims, their immigration court dates are years away. In the meantime, an illegal alien can obtain a work permit, known as an employment authorization document, once an asylum claim has been pending for just 180 days, regardless of how baseless the claim. 2, DHS's unlawful categorical parole triggers immediate work permit eligibility. The Biden administration is now hiding the optics of the border crisis from the American people through the DHS secretary's unlawful use of the parole authority. Section 212D5 of the Immigration and Nationality Act is clear that parole is a narrow authority only appropriate on a case-by-case basis for an urgent humanitarian reason or significant public benefit. The Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan parole program is not a safe, lawful pathway, as you may have heard, but it is a blatant disregard of the law to allow the mass release of 360,000 illegal aliens a year into American communities. The same is true for the parole scheme DHS is running via the CBP One app. According to reports, the Biden administration has already paroled at least 541,000 illegal aliens into the U.S. and intends to continue doing so by tens of thousands every single month. What many do not realize is that the parole scheme is even more lucrative to illegal aliens at the expense of American workers. Parolees are immediately eligible to apply for a work permit. Additionally, through a combination of loopholes and questionable statutory definitions, illegal aliens with parole become eligible for unemployment payments, welfare, and other taxpayer-funded benefits that are not available to so-called asylum seekers. In conclusion, illegal immigration harms American workers. The number one priority for U.S. immigration policy should be the American people. Instead, the Biden administration has flipped this logic on its head, prioritized illegal aliens, and sidelined American workers. Research shows that the current high levels of illegal immigration harm U.S. workers without a college degree, minorities, the young, the disabled, and other marginalized workers. Through its open border policies, the Biden administration is opting to use unlawful means to import cheap illegal alien labor. This is the epitome of an America Last policy. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Law. I'd like to next recognize Dr. Camerata for your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Stephen Camerata, and I am Director of Research at the Center for Immigration Studies. And I want to thank you for inviting me to testify on the very important issue of illegal immigration's impact on the U.S. workforce. Now, due in part to the enormous influx at the southern border, we estimate that the illegal immigrant population living in the United States has grown to 12.6 million by May of this year, an increase of 2.4 million just since January of 2021, so less than 2.5 years. There are now likely 9 million illegal immigrants in the U.S. workforce. Now, traditionally, one of the most important reasons to limit immigration and then enforce those limits had always been to protect American workers. In terms of the impact on the labor force, illegal immigration primarily adds lower skilled labor to the U.S. 7 out of 10 illegal immigrants are thought to have no education beyond high school, for example. As a result, they mainly compete with less educated U.S.-born and legal immigrants in jobs such as construction, building, cleaning and maintenance, groundskeeping, retail sales, food service, and food processing. There is good evidence that immigration does reduce the wages and employment of some U.S.-born workers, though it's difficult to distinguish the impact of illegal immigration from immigration overall. A 2007 comprehensive report by the National Academy of Sciences cited over a dozen studies showing a negative impact on American workers from immigration, mainly again on the less educated. Now, given their education level and concentration across occupations, it's important to note most Americans are not in competition with illegal immigrants for jobs. But those that are tend to be the poorest and least educated. We estimate that in the 24 occupations where illegal immigrants are most concentrated, there are about 5.7 million U.S.-born workers still employed. And they're mostly people with modest levels of education. Now, by increasing the supply of workers and lowering wages, immigration can increase profits for employers or lower prices for consumers. But there's no free lunch here. These benefits require some Americans, typically the poorest at the bottom end of the labor force, to lose out. There has been a well-documented long-term stagnation, or even in some cases outright decline in wages for the less educated, which by itself is problematic. Moreover, low wages is one of the reasons for the extremely troubling decades-long deterioration in labor force participation, which measures the share of working-age people who are either working or at least looking for work. There are now 44 million working-age U.S.-born Americans not in the labor force, about 10 million more than in 2000. These individuals do not show up as unemployed because they're not actively looking for work. You have to look for work in the last 4 weeks. If the participation rate overall of the U.S.-born would just return, say, to the level in 2000, it would add 6 million workers to the U.S. workforce. Even among prime age U.S.-born men, 25 to 54, the group most likely to work, the share in the labor force, if they don't have, say, any education beyond high school, has declined from 96% in 1960 to 82% now. A large body of research shows the decline has enormous negative consequences for society, including contributing to crime, drug overdose, social isolation, welfare dependency, and suicide. Illegal immigration is not the only reason for this decline in work. However, using immigration to keep down wages makes work less attractive. Further, filling jobs with immigrants, many of whom are illegal, has allowed policymakers to ignore the huge decline in labor force participation, even though it's no secret. There's books written on it. The Obama White House wrote about it. Either we undertake the difficult, and it will be difficult, policy and social reforms necessary to address the disastrous decline in labor force participation, or we continue to allow in ever more immigrants and then somehow come up with various Band-Aids to deal with all the social pathologies that come from having so many working-age people not working. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Camarata. And now we'll recognize Mr. Costa for your testimony.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to testify. As the son of immigrants myself, I believe that the United States has benefited greatly from immigration, both economically and culturally. And it's not just me who believes that. There's a broad consensus among economists that immigration has an overall positive impact on the long-run economic growth of the United States. While it is always important to assess how current realities and policies impact workers' and labor standards, it must be noted at the outset of this hearing that there is little to no evidence that recent arrivals to the U.S. border are having a detrimental impact on U.S. workers, wages, or employment. And I wish to remind the members of the subcommittee that the vast majority of people arriving are turning themselves in to border officials and requesting that they be assessed for eligibility for the available forms of humanitarian relief that are established in U.S. law, such as asylum. Most are following the law and going through a legal process, contrary to much of the rhetoric about lawlessness at the border. If one listens to some of the current rhetoric that's out there, including in this hearing, one would think that the American economy was in the midst of a recession. But in fact, the major economic indicators reveal that the U.S. economy is doing well, growing, and that workers are seeing wage gains. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the 3.8% unemployment rate for August 2023 means that the nation's unemployment rate has been below 4% since January 2022. That's the longest stretch of sub-4% unemployment since the 1960s. Job openings hit record highs in 2022 and remain substantially above pre-pandemic records. The labor force participation rate of prime age workers, meaning those between the ages of 25 and 54, hit its highest level in decades this summer. And strong nominal wage growth has started delivering reliable gains in inflation-adjusted wages for most workers in recent months as the inflationary shock of 2022 subsides. In short, nothing in the labor market data in recent years would indicate that the U.S. has too many workers relative to jobs. This is, in fact, the most favorable balance between labor demand and supply we've seen in decades. These economic gains were largely achieved through policy choices that prioritize rapid recovery and investments to make us more resilient in the future. Other indicators show that the strong economy has also reached traditionally disadvantaged groups. Wage growth in 2022 was by far the fastest among the lowest wage workers. The prime age labor force participation rate and employment to population ratio of black workers has hit record highs in the past year, and the unemployment rate of black workers has hit record lows. That is not to say that the economy is perfect. There's still more we can do to lock in and improve on recent gains, but we should all be honest about the current state of the economy. Immigrant workers are a vital part of the U.S. economy and are responsible for 17% of total GDP in the United States and have contributed to recent gains. They work in jobs across the economic spectrum and in a wide range of occupations. But when it comes to the U.S. immigration system, I don't mean to suggest that the system is perfect or even working optimally. In fact, in some key ways, our immigration system isn't working for workers, but is instead benefiting low-road employers who exploit the immigration status of immigrants. Thus, Congress should pass laws that reform the immigration system in ways that lift standards so that all workers can have equal and enforceable rights, regardless of immigration status. And perhaps, most importantly for this hearing, I wish to state in no uncertain terms that the problems facing the American workforce are not what happens at the border, but what happens at the workplace. Threats to labor standards come from rampant law-breaking by employers who operate with near impunity, and this subcommittee has the authority and jurisdiction to move legislation that could make significant positive impacts in the lives of working people, regardless of race, gender, or immigration status, by lifting standards and holding law-breaking employers accountable. Some of the key pieces of legislation that could achieve this include the Raise the Wage Act, the Protect the Right to Organize Act, the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, the Asuncion Valdivia Heat Illness, Injury, and Fatality Prevention Act, and also the Combating Child Labor Act. In addition, as I discussed in detail in my written testimony, Congress must appropriate more funding to labor standards enforcement agencies like the Wage and Hour Division. Agencies like WHD, OSHA, and the NLRB need more investigators, agents, and lawyers, which requires a sharp increase in funding. Not providing them more funding, or by implementing a de facto cut through a government shutdown, will have a negative impact on the wages and working conditions of all workers. When Congress spends $25 billion per year to enforce immigration laws, but only $2 billion on the agencies that protect wages and working conditions, it reveals what its true priorities are. And finally, I wish to note that the organizations pushing for lower immigration levels and that scapegoat and demonize immigrants often cite protecting American workers as a reason for their advocacy, falsely claiming that more worksite raids and border enforcement will improve labor standards. But for some reason, I never hear those same groups mention solutions such as these, whether to raise the minimum wage or protect labor rights or to better fund the Labor Department, which would clearly and obviously raise wages and improve workplace standards. That simple fact seriously calls into question the credibility of anti-immigrant groups when it comes to the topic of American workers and labor standards. Members of Congress should thus be skeptical of their claims, including during this hearing. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. And our final witness will recognize Dr. Holtz-Eakin, please, for your testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Good, Ranking Member DeSaulnier, members of the committee for the privilege of being here today. Let me make a few brief points, and then I look forward to answering your questions. The first point is that work by illegal aliens is a significant part of the labor force in the United States. You can measure this one of two ways. You can look at estimates of the number of here illegally as a fraction of total employment in the United States, and you get something like 4 to 7% of the of the work is being done by illegal aliens, or you could look at recent flows in 2022 and recent job creation in the same year, and you get a much larger number, something as large as 13% of the employment is being done by illegal immigrants. So this is a significant phenomenon in the American labor market. The second point is that we don't know, as a matter of economic logic, what the impact will be on work by the native-born. The obvious fact is that illegal immigrants get paid less, about 11% less on average, and this leads to an incentive to substitute illegal immigrants for domestic native-born workers. That impact is what most people focus on. However, those employers willing to do that also get some cost savings in the process and may be able to employ more people overall, including some domestic workers. So you don't know without actually looking at the data the net impact on the native-born workers. But we do know, and this is the third point, that the presence of those here illegally working has negative impacts on the overall performance of the labor market. First of all, there's a lot of skill mismatch when illegal aliens are employed. You end up with the sort of stereotypical PhD driving a taxi, would be much more productive in another part of the economy if they were here legally. And that skill mismatch lowers the overall productivity and output in the economy. It's a loss to every American. Similarly, those who are here illegally tend to have higher turnover. They leave jobs more quickly, they don't stay. Employers faced with a labor force that is more volatile are going to be less likely to hire people. That's a cost. They have to train them. They have to go through the search process. And so overall, desire to employ workers goes down. That hurts everybody. And the lower training provided by firms leaves fewer skills in the labor market as a whole. That hurts everybody as well. We get lower wages and lower productivity. So there are some costs to having a large fraction of the work being provided by illegal aliens. The last point is the interaction with the opioid epidemic, fentanyl in particular. There's the obvious impact of the fact that the border crossings are illegal, and that's a big source of the fentanyl. But there's an indirect impact as well. Work we've done at the American Action Forum indicates that the opioid epidemic could be responsible for the loss of up to 1.3 million workers from the labor force. That does two things. Obviously, it hurts the country's ability to be successful and produce. It also raises the incentive to hire people who are here illegally to replace those workers who are no longer present in the labor force. So this is an important issue. I'm glad that the subcommittee is holding a hearing on it, and I'm pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin. And under Committee Rule 9, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will wait to ask my questions and therefore recognize Mr. Wilson from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Biden's open border policies forgets the mass murder of 9/11. It has allowed hundreds of identified terrorists to cross every state in America. These terrorists are highly skilled, well-paid, trained mass murderers, and they're threatening every American family. Additionally, this hearing addresses destroying American jobs. Dr. Camarado, you estimate that there are 9 million illegal aliens currently in the U.S. workforce. Sadly, this number continues to rise as the crisis at the border continues to worsen due to the Biden administration's suicidal open border policies. Can you explain how the increase in the number of illegal aliens would impact American workers?
Yeah, I mean, basically what we're doing is increasing the supply of labor at the bottom end of the labor market. Now, I agree with some of my panelists. There are lots of problems at the bottom end of the labor market, and I think we should look at everything from the deindustrialization of the United States to our minimum wage laws, but adding all those workers to the bottom end of the labor market has consequences. And the two key is to reduce wages and let us ignore the massive decline in labor force participation. One point, labor force participation for immigrants has not declined in the same way. So a lot of people conflate it with the overall because they put the immigrants in the data. But when you take out the native born and look at men, you see that the current labor force participation rate looks terrible.
And indeed, I so often when I go to fast food restaurants or grocery stores or any store, I compliment the workers there on the entry-level jobs, because one day they could be the leaders of our country. And so the entry-level jobs are being denied. And Dr. Holsekin, there has been a shocking decline, which is inconceivable to me, of the labor force participation rate among Americans, dropping from 77% to 70% in just 20 years. Meaningful lives are being destroyed. Are there any strategies that we can consider to encourage Americans to re-enter the workforce?
There are really two major issues. One is the sort of pull of social welfare programs and others where eligibility is not contingent on work. The committee could look at those. And then there's improving the skills of workers and their wages and to attract them back into the labor force. This decline has been concentrated in men, and I think focusing on the male labor force participation rate would be a good place to start.
And it's, again, it's sad how much this could benefit their families, but gosh, meaningful lives of persons who their lives consist of being on a sofa with a remote control. How horrific, and so thank you for your efforts. And Mr. Law, since taking office, President Biden has undermined Americans' border security and integrity of our immigration system at every turn. I previously practiced immigration law, and I have seen a good system to welcome new citizens. Biden has dismantled the successful American first border security policies that he inherited from President Donald Trump, and as a result, he is overseeing the worst border crisis in American history. Under President Biden, over 5 million illegal aliens have come through our southern border. How has the rollback of the successful Trump administration enforcement policies fueled by this crisis, what is your assessment of strict enforcement against illegal aliens? And I need to add, too, the southern border and the northern border. And I'm really grateful that Congresswoman Elise Stefanik has identified the northern border today as an entry point into our country.
Well, thank you. You're absolutely right. There is not a single deterrent policy of the Biden administration when it comes to illegal immigration. They are, in fact, encouraging it, which has made the cartels and the traffickers billions of dollars. And you're right, it's not just the southern border anymore. The northern border is an exposed access point. And as I mentioned, through parole, they are now flying in inadmissible aliens into international airports. So they're not showing up at the southern border any longer in that data set, but they are still being allowed into the country despite not qualifying for a visa.
And indeed, the issues of human trafficking is just inconceivable to allow the cartels to have this ability. The fentanyl coming into our country, nearly 100,000 people killed annually, and complicit with the Chinese Communist Party providing the drugs into our country. The administration is overlooking all of this and putting every American family at risk of a terrorist attack. They're here, they're coming, and they're just ignoring it. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Now we'll recognize Mr. Courtney for your questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses for being here today. And, again, all of us just came back from a break where we were all home and had a chance to sort of see firsthand, what's going on in terms of the labor market in all of our corners of the country. In eastern Connecticut, where, again, because of the Biden budgets for Navy shipbuilding, we had last Friday, we reached the 4,000 mark for the first 8 months of 2023 in terms of new hires at General Dynamics Electric Boat Shipyard. Their goal is to be at 6,000 before the end of the calendar year, and they are on track because of some really smart investments in terms of metal trades job training through the Department of Labor Workforce Investment Act, and also then supplemented by Navy funds in terms of giving people the right skills to take advantage of these careers. These are not temporary jobs by any stretch. And the ripple effect in terms of what that means in terms of the region and also the supply chain, which basically reaches out to all 50 states, is part of what I think is the good news story in terms of the U.S. labor market. 187,000 jobs. New hires last month, defying all the experts who said that we're going into a recession. There is not more workers than jobs. I was at a job fair also a couple days ago, and again, it wasn't just GD that was looking for new employees. It was every sector: hospitality, healthcare, the also other private sector firms that were there, and they still had actually pretty good foot traffic in terms of people coming through. So, Mr. Costa, when we talk about what the premise of today's hearing is that jobs are being stolen from American workers, I mean, the data just really doesn't support that that's sort of the state of play, and it's not just my district.
That's
in
right.
terms of where that's the case.
That's right. There's very little evidence to show that, and you have many businesses writing letters asking for the people who are arriving to be able to have work permits. You even have labor unions saying the same thing. Labor unions, who represent American workers, are not decrying, people arriving. They want them to have rights and be able to work.
So we're also 2 weeks away from a government shutdown. I've been through a couple of these. I think Mr. Holtz-Eakin was around for a couple of those rodeos as well. That external shock, which is what it really amounts to in terms of the U.S. economy, even with essential workers still going to work every day, to me, if we really want to do something important for American workers, we should do our job. I mean, the good news is Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, and House Democrats are ready to move in terms of avoiding a completely self-inflicted wound to the U.S. economy if we don't, give our appropriations bills probably the 3 to 4 weeks they need to get negotiated and settled. So again, Mr. Costa, could you comment in terms of what a shutdown would mean to the U.S. labor market?
Well, for workers, it would mean quite a lot. Having a funding cut or a de facto cut through a government shutdown would mean less funding for the federal agencies that protect workers, like the Wage and Hour Division, which are already vastly underfunded at 2006 levels after adjusting for inflation. So how do you protect workers if you don't have staff and funding for the agencies that make sure that they're paid fairly for every hour that they work?
And not for nothing, I mean, Border Security would be impacted with a government shutdown. I mean, the Border Patrol, ICE, again, a lot of them would be designated as essential workers. We know that, but they would be forced to come to work without a paycheck.
There's already a lack of investment in the part of the immigration system to process asylum seekers and benefits, and so the issue is that there's not enough staff and time to process people fairly and humanely, and so with budget cuts, it's just going to be even worse.
You're absolutely right. The kink in the garden hose in terms of the immigration system actually is the asylum process, which we have underfunded in terms of getting these cases disposed of, the majority of which people fail to actually succeed in their asylum applications. And, again, a shutdown is just going to aggravate that problem at the border as well. In page 12 of your testimony, you talked about actually where there is a real problem for American workers, which is the lax enforcement of the HB1 program, where, again, sometimes high-tech jobs are being taken away by companies who basically are using overseas workers to come in and displace. I'm running out of my time here now, but hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss that. If we want to do something useful on this committee, we should focus on that abuse, which really hurts American workers. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Wahlberg from Michigan for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Since President Biden took office, more than 300,000 migrant children have come alone to the United States, alone to the United States, alone to the United States. On top of this, according to the New York Times, the Biden administration has lost contact with nearly 100,000 of these unaccompanied minors. A shocking number of these children are exploited by their sponsors, who are often criminals, traffickers, and members of transnational criminal organizations. And they're forced to work in order to pay debts to their sponsors. In May, Chairwoman Fox, myself, and Congresswoman Chavez de Remer sent a letter to the DOL requesting documents related to DOL's coordination with other federal agencies regarding this serious matter. To date, the Department of Labor has not provided any of the internal documents requested in this letter. There are answers. There's data, but nothing has been sent back to us. Mr. Law, do you believe that President Biden's open border policies created this humanitarian crisis?
Oh, there's no question. With the change in administration, the border situation, it's night and day. You had the most secure border in our nation's history through a number of policies that I outlined in my oral and written testimony. And the Biden administration on day one, over the objection of career Border Patrol officials, tore it all down and encouraged a mass-scale immigration asylum fraud. They know that these people do not qualify. They're largely economic migrants, and while you may sympathize for their circumstances, you are encouraging them to be connected with traffickers, to take on debts that they cannot afford, to be allowed into the United States for a benefit that they do not qualify for, and then you put them in an uncertain situation where they're supposed to be ordered removed, but then this administration has essentially nullified and defunded ICE through their policies as well.
And our border agents are not allowed to do their job. And kids are being hurt as a result of this. The Biden administration has touted its creation of the Interagency Task Force to combat child labor exploitation. However, I'm concerned that this task force amounts to just window dressing. It's my understanding that as of June 14th, there has only been one meeting and not a single full-time DOL staff person dedicated to the task force. This is deeply troubling because I'm concerned that the Biden administration is failing this vulnerable population, kids, and putting them in severe danger. I've introduced the Enhancing Detection of Human Trafficking Act, a bipartisan bill with my colleague, Representative Sablon, that requires the Department of Labor to ensure its employees are regularly educated on how to detect and respond to the instances of human trafficking and are even interested in doing it. This bill has passed the House previously with bipartisan support, and it's my hope that we can do it again. Mr. Law, as far as you know, is the Biden administration doing anything to address the exploitation of these migrant children?
I'm not aware of anything productive. I would say they are actually contributing to the problem. For example, they have stopped any sort of DNA testing at the border when you have a claimed familial relationship, a parent and child. Once the unaccompanied alien children are transferred to Health and Human Services, they are cutting them loose to sponsors who are unvetted. They remove the vetting requirements for people to work in those facilities. There is a significant likelihood that our federal government has essentially handed over these vulnerable migrants to their trafficking networks to be subjected to further abuse. And the New York Times, I think, has several articles that have exposed the horrific conditions that are the result of open border policies, and not the compassion that was claimed by this administration when they took office.
And to think that our government has been part of the trafficking process, that's tragic. And that's something that has to end. Thank you for answering the questions, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson, or Mr. Wahlberg. And now we will go to Ms. Hayes from Connecticut for her question, or 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you to everyone who is here today, and thank you to our witnesses. It's very difficult for me to formulate questions for this hearing because it's all over the place. It is outside of the jurisdiction of this committee, and much of what we are talking about today is political theater that we can't move on in this committee. With the looming government shutdown and everything that is at stake, I'm quite surprised that we are having this conversation today, but yet we are here. So I'd like to use my time just to talk about some of the things that have been brought up in this hearing, because I do agree that we have a vulnerable population of children that we are failing in this country. A report came out yesterday that said child poverty rates doubled in the last year when the child tax credit was not extended. We have reports that talk about children who do not, the number of preschool and childcare slots that will be cut in this country, and we have the ability to fix those things with the upcoming budget. We do need to reform our immigration system, but I would like to just speak to some of the things that have been said today. About terrorists and the connection to open borders and September 11th. We are literally a week out from the anniversary of 9/11, and I will just say that while all of the hijackers who committed the 9/11 terrorist attack were foreigners, all of them entered the country legally. So it is not the same as what we are talking about today. So it is disingenuous to try to link our southern border and the people who are seeking asylum through the southern border to terrorist attacks on 9/11 and future attacks on this country. We should pass the Raise the Wage Act, the PRO Act, universal child care if we want to address labor issues in this country. Those are some real and substantive steps to do those things. In my state, with the budget that is proposed, going from 2024 spending levels to 2022, we would eliminate 3,800 preschool and childcare slots, cut $44 million in funding for schools serving low-income children, and reduce support for 80,000 children with disabilities. I will ask a question to Mr. Costa. At the border, a 22% reduction in funding cuts necessary abilities to manage borders safely and securely, putting the Department of Homeland Security at risk. The Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor will see an across-the-board reduction in funding levels that would result in $156 million less in back wages for 135,000 workers. In your testimony, you mentioned the Wage and Hour Division is already understaffed and underfunded, leading to backlogs and delays, enabling exploitation in the workplace. Do you believe that the proposed budget cuts that we're seeing today would benefit U.S. and foreign workers? And if not, what do you think Congress should be investing in to make sure that these things are happening?
Without a doubt, I think that cuts to the Wage and Hour Division will hurt all workers, regardless of race, gender, immigration status, and I think much bigger investments are needed.
And we also saw that the role that H-2A and H-2B programs that serve tens of thousands of foreign workers each year. With fewer resources for enforcement, would that reduce the employers' initiatives to comply with basic labor and immigration laws that we're seeing?
That's correct. In addition to protecting a workforce of 165 million people, the Wage and Hour Division is in charge of the H-1B program, which has 600,000 workers, and H-2A and H-2B, which is close to 500,000 workers. It's a Herculean task, and without the ability to enforce those workers on those visas, it's very hard for them to complain because of their visa status. They're afraid of retaliation and deportation. So employers will be able to get away essentially with impunity to break the law.
And finally, I would just like to say, thank you so much for that answer, but I would just like to say, we hear over and over in this committee and in hearings related to this topic how asylum seekers and immigrants who present themselves at the border immediately take advantage of welfare and benefits and social programs, and we all just know that that's not true. They're not eligible for those benefits. After a person is granted asylum, there are certain programs that they can apply for and receive benefits, but it is not true that, to use your words, an illegal, I'm not even going to say it, I'm not even going to say those words, but a person who presents himself at the border immediately begins to take advantage of benefits in the United States. It's just a lie. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Allen from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel for being here. Obviously, whether we care to admit it, we have a serious problem at our southern border, and we've got a serious problem in this country as far as workforce is concerned. All I heard in my district was workforce. And, why this administration and the Department of Labor aren't addressing this, I don't know. But let's talk about the border. First, you need to understand that these people who are seeking asylum are seeking it through the cartels. And the cartels are requiring these people to be indentured servants, meaning that if they come to this country and they find work, they're not paying taxes, they're sending the money right back to the very cartels and enriching them, so it is nothing more than human trafficking. And when you enrich the cartels, then they're in every business out there: agriculture, illicit drugs, how in the world this administration can explain the fentanyl coming in this country and how they can't stop this? I mean, it's killed 100,000 people. How do you get away with that? Mr. Law, again, I don't quite understand the divide here. I mean, I would hope all Americans would come together on this issue because it is the biggest national security threat we face today. And if you don't believe that, I don't know where you're coming from. You just talk to the intel people. But the bottom line is, in comparison to the policies that were put in place by the Trump administration and the securing of the border, I mean, is that not a national security issue?
Well, thank you. Securing the border absolutely is a national security issue, and I'd point specifically to the known Godaway population, the people that don't surrender themselves and have been allowed to basically come across the border largely undetected. There's a serious concern that those are your national security threats, your public safety concerns. If I could just briefly correct the mischaracterization of my prior testimony, I did not say that all asylum seekers get on welfare. What I said is that those who are being unlawfully paroled into this country are considered to be qualified aliens after 1 year, which makes them eligible for welfare. That's a distinction that was mischaracterized.
Exactly. And as far as as far as their work permit process, can Mr. Camardo, can you explain how that works? It's like, how do they get a visa to work if they are here on asylum? Yes.
Well, the way administration, as I understand it, is doing this is that after a period of time, if you have a pending asylum application, they are issuing the work authorization, and the same with a number of parolees. Not everyone is getting work authorization, but we know that a very large fraction of people without work authorization can work in the United States anyway, because this system, we don't enforce our laws really against hiring illegal immigrants. So even if they don't have work authorization, they can still often work. And that's why of the 9 million who are working in the United States who are here illegally, millions of them do have work authorization. That's one of the great contradictions. You're not allowed to be here. You're not supposed to be here, but we let you work here. But millions don't. So it's like roughly 50-50.
Right. And the money they make is going to the cartels and going back home. And so what we have is, 45 million people on some type of safety net program in this country, and that number varies, obviously. And we know that there are a large percentage of those people who are work capable. So they're not getting the jobs, which would obviously reduce mandatory spending because they're on, the mandatory spending are the safety net programs. Yet we have people coming in, getting work visas, taking the jobs away from the very people who we're trying to get out of generational welfare. Who would allow a system like that to, Mr. Law, why would we allow that, an administration to do that?
I mean, it is a baffling question where you think that the administration's number one goal should be the benefit of the American worker, the American people.
Exactly. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. And now I'd like to recognize Ms. Jayapal from Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with the facts. I'm extremely disappointed in the title and the content of this hearing. This question of the net effect of immigration on our economy has been studied over decades, and the evidence is robust that immigration benefits American workers and the economy. But that's not what you're hearing from my colleagues across the aisle, because what they want is not for you to know the facts, but rather to drive up fear of immigrants, to once again use that fear of immigrants as a political football to score cheap political points. What we know from the last administration is that when policy is driven by xenophobia and fear, we all lose. As president, Donald Trump cut off most legal immigration and increased travel restrictions on immigrants during the pandemic. Consequently, the U.S. economy saw lasting harms from those missing immigrant workers. Mr. Costa, can you explain how this lack of immigrant workers has contributed to worker shortages and harm to the economy?
Yes, except for temporary work visa programs, President Trump cut many of the immigration pathways, especially those that would lead to a green card where people would have equal rights. And then none other than Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, said himself that the main reasons for fewer workers was, number one, immigration and the COVID pandemic, with many people dying and being sick with long COVID. So the cuts to immigration have really led to the situation that you're describing.
Thank you. And can you dive into the specifics of how immigrants create jobs and actually create new opportunities for workers?
Yes, there's a number of studies that show that immigrants are creating jobs at higher rates than native-born workers. And then, of course, immigrants spend money and invest in the economy, buy homes, and that creates more demand, which creates more jobs.
In fact, it's not just your institution that believes this, Mr. Costa. The findings that immigrants benefit our economy comes from think tanks across the ideological spectrum, including the Cato Institute. 2 months ago, Mr. David Beer of the Cato Institute said this: legal immigration is so restrictive that the system punishes Americans who want to associate, contract, and trade with people around the world. Americans lose out on the social and economic capital that immigrants bring. Our system deprives U.S. consumers of the goods and services that immigrants would provide and denies our towns and cities entrepreneurs and small business owners. This system has caused chaos at the border, harming Americans and immigrants alike, end quote. The common conclusion is that the restrictive legal immigration system that is what hurts the American people and our economy, not immigrants themselves. I think what this committee should really be focusing on is the corporate greed that is sucking dry our workers through stolen wages. A report from the Economic Policy Institute showed that between 2017 and 2020, over $3 billion in stolen wages was recovered for workers by the U.S. Department of Labor, state agencies, and class action litigation, and that wage theft costs American workers close to $50 billion a year. So, Mr. Costa, how are corporations allowed to engage in this level of wage theft, and what impact does that level of wage theft have on our workers and our economy?
Right, those numbers you cite are likely just the tip of the iceberg, and we don't see CEOs being taken to jail for stealing billions in wages, unfortunately. But the reason it happens is because we have 800 wage and hour division investigators to police a labor market of 165 million people, and their funding for wage and hour is at 2006 levels, adjusted for inflation. They need a massive influx of money, maybe tripling the number of investigators. It's really at a historic low. You cannot protect workers. You cannot protect wages and working conditions if you do not have people on the job making sure that employers are following the law.
That's right. And actually, if we had a functioning immigration system where we could provide a pathway to citizenship for families, where we could provide legal pathways for people to come in, you wouldn't have employers having the same opportunity to manipulate immigrant workers in particular. How is the immigrant workforce disproportionately affected by wage theft, and how does that hurt the entire workforce?
There's a very seminal study that showed that unauthorized immigrant workers are more than twice as likely to be the victims of wage theft. Legal immigrants are also more likely to be the victims of wage theft. But even U.S. workers suffer wage theft. Low-wage U.S. workers suffer wage theft at very high rates, at about 16% of low-wage American workers.
Well, here's the bottom line. Immigrants contribute to our economy. What hurts the economy is a restrictive, xenophobic immigration system. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we can also honor the request from
Thank you. The gentlelady's time
members
has
to
expired.
have a hearing on the rise of child labor. On the rise of child labor.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you. Now I'll recognize Mr. Bean from Florida for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, and good morning, committee members, and to our guests. Welcome. I thought this was going to be it. I thought that this was going to be the issue that ties the two sides up here, and you can see that we're apart on so many issues, but this was the one, the issue that's literally destroying our country, an open border, and today we see the written testimony that it's destroying wages for the American worker, it's breaking the back of the American taxpayer. So surely Republicans and Democrats would come together and say, how can we fix the problem? But yet this hearing has already been labeled political theater. Maybe if you go to the border, one of the first things, and I'm just a new guy, I've only been here 9 months, but one of the first things that I did, honoring a commitment to my constituents, was to go to the border and see it firsthand. And it's devastating. Things we saw earlier, just being overrun, our border patrol, and how heartbreaking it is to see kids that are dropped off and used as pawns coming forward. So if you thought this was going to be it, as did I, you would be incorrect. So we've got to fix it, and we've got to go forward. Mr. Law, why is it, and I don't know if you can do it in a short period of time, but why is it that it surged under Biden? Under the current administration, the border has just surged. Why is that? Is there a simple explanation why that is?
Yes, there is. Specifically, the Remain in Mexico policy was completely destroyed, and any illegal alien that claimed asylum at the border was allowed to be released. Our immigration laws only give two options for those who show up at the border and claim asylum. You can detain them, or you can make them wait in Mexico. This administration is doing neither. They are releasing them into American communities and then making them eligible for work permits. And there is no interior enforcement, so there is no repercussions that they will likely ever be returned to their home country anytime soon.
So when I talked to, when I was in South America over the last couple of months and talking to people who are migrating or making the journey, they've already talked to people that are here, and they believe the United States is open, and all they do is get there. It makes sense that they would believe that, because that's true, Mr. Law?
Oh, absolutely. And, word travels fast, and that's when you see somebody gets in, that encourages, the next flow, whether it's a relative, a neighbor, friend, whomever it may be. And that's exactly why the Trump administration policies were so successful at securing the border. When you were presented with the opportunity of you can wait in Mexico instead of getting released into American communities, we saw so many asylum claims abandoned. They just asked to be returned home. When the asylum cooperative agreements were reached, and you said, okay, well, you can seek humanitarian relief at a neighboring country where there's shared language and other similarities, all of a sudden they said, I'd rather just be returned home. So again, they are just not fleeing persecution. They are seeking out economic opportunity. And while you can sympathize, they do not qualify for humanitarian relief under the law as it is currently written.
It is sad. In South America, we saw the wristbands where they, in their mind, they've paid their fare to the cartels, which are becoming increasingly stronger and increasingly do bad things both to South Americans and to Americans. Mr. Camerota, you've done extensive work, and your written testimony really illustrates the winners and losers of an open border. Winners, of course, are illegal aliens. The losers are taxpayers and the American worker. Can you explain, I don't know if you can do it in just the brief time we have, how does it push down? Because some say it's great. Some say, I won't mention any names on this committee, but some say this is a great thing that we have an open border, but yet it's destroying wages. Can you explain, so everybody can understand, how it destroys wages for the American worker?
Look, historically, progressives from Eugene Jebs to A. Philip Randolph, they got that if you have lots of immigration, you tend to push down wages. And there's a reason, unfortunately, a lot of progressives are aligned with corporate America on this. They want low wages, and they're perfectly happy to ignore this crisis of non-work among working age people, particularly the U.S.-born. Immigrants haven't suffered the same problem, particularly U.S.-born men without a college degree, and we know it's a social disaster. In his seminal book, Nick Eberstadt at AEI asked the question, why do we ignore it? And one of the key answers is we have the immigrant labor. If we curtailed immigration and enforced our law, we would be forced to draw these people back in, which will not be easy. They have substance abuse problems. Some are abusing the welfare system. Some just haven't worked for a while. Consider the population of people who have criminal records. We've got to draw those folks back into the labor market as well. Less immigration would be enormously helpful, but it's not the only issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean, I'd like to recognize now Ms. Manning from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the policies that we put in place during the last Congress, We are living in a time of historically low unemployment, and what I hear over and over from my constituents is their inability to find workers who are trained and qualified to fill the good jobs that are out there, particularly jobs we are seeing growing in my district in advanced manufacturing and clean energy. Now, we've made progress over the past 2 years in providing funding for apprenticeships and other programs that will help those who are not in the workforce prepare themselves for those good jobs. But what I heard during the recess is that what my constituents are really worried about are not just the lack of ability to find workers, but the budget cuts that are being proposed that could hurt the progress that we are making. Budget cuts that will hurt our K through 12 schools, our colleges, our apprenticeship programs. My constituents are also worried about the lack of mental health resources and the violence in our communities that need more investment, not less. So I'd like to start by focusing on the budget cuts that will have a negative impact on our workforce and my constituents. Mr. Costa, how will eliminating the WIOA Adult Youth and Job Training Program impact the ability to meet our current workforce demands?
Well, really, any investments like that, cutting them and taking them away is going to make it harder to hire more qualified workers.
And what about eliminating the Women's Bureau, which includes apprenticeship programs for women, particularly in non-traditional occupations? How will that impact our workforce?
Well, that'll make it more difficult to hire and for women in particular to access the workforce.
And how would the $95 million cut to OSHA impact our ability to keep our workers safe?
That would be a disaster by making all workplaces less safe. There's already not enough OSHA enforcement nationwide, and it needs to be increased, not cut.
My colleagues want to focus this hearing on immigration, and I'd like to point out that before the recess, we had a hearing in this committee where my colleagues excoriated the Secretary of HHS over reports of child migrants being put to work in dangerous jobs in violation of our U.S. labor laws. So, Mr. Costa, what impact will cutting $3.3 billion from the HHS Unaccompanied Children Program, as well as the Refugee Support Services, have on the ability of our government to ensure that child migrants are not being exploited?
Right. I think we're all concerned after seeing the New York Times reporting about HHS and oversight with child migrants, and I think that we need more investments to have more staff and more attention. And also, I have to mention in that context that we need to be enforcing child labor laws and improving them, not rolling them back.
Dr. Camerata, you stated that the American workers who are most impacted by undocumented immigrants are those who are least educated and those who are least prepared for work. Would cutting funds for apprenticeship and job training programs help get those unemployed workers into the workforce?
Well, speaking for myself, I have always been supportive of ideas of job training. We should look at raising the minimum wage and things like that. So I suspect you and I agree on those kinds of issues, but we're much less likely to do it if we have access to immigrant labor.
Well, let me ask you, but would cutting those funds help those people out there who are American workers who are not currently trained and ready for the workforce?
Yes, I mean, I think that we should look very hard at whether or not the program's effective. And if it's ineffective, we definitely should keep it, in my opinion.
And would cutting funding for Title I schools help get those untrained workers into the workforce?
If it's an effective program, it should definitely be kept, and we should focus on that because clearly we have a crisis at the bottom end of our labor market.
And would you agree with me that cutting funding for mental health services is going to prevent people from getting the access they need to mental health services to get them back into the workforce?
I state this in my testimony. Mental illness is one of the impediments to improving labor force participation. We definitely need more treatment options.
Thank you. In closing, I would agree that our immigration laws are broken and terribly outdated. And that's why I am one of the co-sponsors of the Dignity Act, the first bipartisan immigration bill to be introduced in more than 10 years. I would encourage my colleagues to look at this bipartisan approach and to do something proactive to solve this problem by joining on the bill. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. And now I'd like to recognize Ms. Houchin from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the committee for having this hearing and to our witnesses. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The Biden border crisis has made every single state, including my state of Indiana, a border state. Every state is now impacted by an open southern border. It doesn't matter if we're in Eagle Pass, Texas, or back home in my home of Salem, Indiana, which is 1,288 miles away from the border. I was able to visit Eagle Pass in Uvalde, Texas earlier this year. I can tell you firsthand, as I'm sure you know, the border is not secure. And I have said to my constituents at home, if the president or anyone else had seen what I have seen and heard at the southern border, they would declare a national crisis and do whatever was necessary to secure our border and restore the sovereignty of the United States. That is certainly a mission that I am on, having been there and seen it firsthand. We're also well aware of the impact our border crisis has had on opioid and fentanyl-related overdose deaths. 220 of my constituents alone have died from drug-related deaths in the last year. What's not talked about enough is the impact of the border crisis on our workforce, so I'm glad we're having this discussion today. Dr. Camerata, you estimate that there are 8.8 million illegal aliens currently in the United States workforce. How did you come to calculate that figure?
Yeah, it's based on data collected by the U.S. Census Bureau on a monthly basis for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's imperfect, but they do attempt to try to capture illegal immigrants, and then they ask questions about, are you working, what kind of job you do. So that's how we can get everybody from Pew to the Center for Migration Studies, the Migration Policy Institute. We all use that data, essentially, that survey and another one, to try to figure out what's going on with the illegal immigration. It's certainly imperfect, and there's a big caveat that I mentioned. The way the survey is weighted, even though I have data through this year, it doesn't take into account the border surge. So all the people being paroled and released, but it's the best we have. So there's probably an underestimate there. I do try to control for that, but I think that's an open question. But it's clear that there's been a surge of illegal immigrants in our workforce if you look at that data.
And I expect these numbers will continue to rise as the crisis at the border continues to worsen when we're continuing to be under what I would consider destructive open border policies. How concerned should we be about further increases in undocumented workers into the United States?
Well, obviously there are many issues, right? And we've touched on some of them, but I am focusing here on the labor force. And again, we have a crisis of non-work. They do not show up in employment. There's this silly, superficial analysis. We have this many unemployed and this many job openings. And look, there's incongruity there. And what do you know? We don't have any workers. And they're ignoring all the people on the economic sidelines. This has been a deterioration for 6 decades for men. There's some deterioration for women more recently, particularly the less educated, particularly people who say have only a high school education. And one of the things immigration is doing is it's holding down wages. There's some crowding out. I'm not arguing they're stealing jobs. That's a silly straw man argument as well. But I am arguing it's letting us ignore this problem. If we didn't have access to all this immigrant labor, employers and the American people, American society, would demand that we try to reinstill the value of work. Raise wages was one of the most important things to make work more attractive. Immigration lets us not do any of that, including the current massive flow of illegal immigration.
And Dr. Camerata, it's sometimes said that illegal immigrants only take jobs that Americans don't want. Can you respond to that claim? Is it true that American workers don't compete with undocumented workers?
As I said, most Americans more educated don't compete with illegal immigrants. But even if you were to look at the 24 occupations where we think illegal immigrants are most concentrated, there are nearly 6 million U.S.-born Americans in those same occupations. And it's just construction labor and building, cleaning, and maintenance, right? And there's at least 2 million legal immigrants in those occupations. The overwhelming majority of workers there are U.S.-born. So the idea that if you have a majority of people being U.S.-born and somehow Americans don't do that work is absurd on its face.
And with the remaining time I have, I'd like to turn to Mr. Law. When I visited the southern border, I met with Border Patrol agents. I visited the unaccompanied minor processing station. I'm very concerned about the more than 300,000 children that have come alone to the United States. And on top of this, according to the New York Times, the Biden administration has lost contact with nearly 100,000 of these unaccompanied minors. As far as you know, is the Biden administration doing anything to address this issue?
No, they're not. They're actually making it worse. And this just goes to show that when you have an open border in a volume that is unsustainable, you cannot keep track of it, whether it's the unaccompanied alien children or single adults as well. If you're allowed into this country, this administration is losing track of you one way or the other.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Houchin. And now I'd like to recognize my good friend from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Costa, we've heard about the cost of illegal immigration. Can you tell me what the economic benefits are of immigration?
Yes. There's a broad economic consensus that immigration is good for the economy in the long run, and not sure I have a specific figure for you on that, though.
In fact, there's some industries that that there's so many people undocumented, construction, hospitality in certain areas. What would happen to these industries if you really cracked down and eliminated all improper immigration?
I think many key industries, including the ones that were considered essential during the pandemic, would essentially collapse. And there's a mix of both undocumented and legal immigrants working in those occupations.
The title of this hearing implies problems with the economy. Can you say a word about how many jobs have been created during the Biden administration?
2021 and 2022 were record numbers, between 2 and 3 million jobs per year, and those are records, and the economy is doing great when it comes to job creation.
And the unemployment rate?
Historic lows, longest stretch of sub 4% unemployment since the 60s.
And if the other side of the aisle describes the economy as bad, does that make it bad?
I do not believe so, sir.
The Fair Labor Standards Act 85 years ago was established minimum wage and overtime. There were exceptions for domestic workers and agricultural workers. Should that exemption be corrected?
I wish it would be corrected. Yes, that exemption is a relic of racist exclusions of those workers when the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted.
So long as jobs exist here, what can really be done to with the laws we have now? To keep people from trying to get into the United States to get the jobs?
Not sure I understand your question, sir.
Well, if there are jobs here and people are coming, talking about it and complaining isn't going to solve anything. And we've heard a lot of complaints about immigration. The last solution we've had was about 15 years ago when the Senate passed a comprehensive immigration bill that collapsed when several of the sponsors of the bill started running for president and found that the rhetoric didn't match the primary voters. But in the absence, aren't we always going to have a problem unless we do comprehensive immigration reform?
I do think we need comprehensive immigration reform. There are so many changes that need to be made in the immigration system, especially to improve labor standards across the system so that workers have equal rights and enforceable rights regardless of their immigration status. Some of the solutions that are out there now would require executive action like temporary protected status and giving work permits to people who are arriving.
Now, if we fail to enforce labor standards for those that are undocumented, how does that affect people who are actually here legally?
Yes, many workplaces, probably most, are actually mixed workplaces where you have undocumented workers and U.S.-born workers and sometimes legal immigrants who are on temporary visas. And if you have this multi-tiered or two-tiered system, People who don't have rights can't speak up and complain when things go wrong on the job, when they don't get paid the wages that they're owed. And so that degrades standards for all workers. And the weak bargaining power of people who don't have rights also then sort of seeps over to the workers who are American workers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I'd now like to recognize my friend, Mr. Burleson from Missouri, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I thought this situation was crazy before I ever came to Washington, D.C., and now that I'm here, I think it's even more. It's just the height of lunacy for a nation to basically commit suicide in the way that we're doing so with our border situation and being a welfare state. Milton Friedman, the famous economist, said it's just obvious that you cannot have a free border state and a welfare state. It's just obvious to anyone who understands math. And yet here we are at a situation in which I'm asking the question, who benefits? Who benefits? Why in the world would any political party or any president of the United States decide, let's open up the borders, right? Because especially from your testimony, we hear the impact on uneducated, lower wage workers, that now that they're being crowded out by immigrants, okay? Not only that, but we have our schools that are being overrun in many parts of the nation. We have our centers who normally provide care and access for the homeless populations are now, the homeless Americans, many of them are vets, are being displaced by people that are coming here illegally. In addition, we also know that the impact on our healthcare system is enormous. And so because we have EMTALA laws, no one can be turned away. And so why in the world, this begs the question, why would anyone have the political lunacy to take on this public policy? What is the self-interest here? Dr. Camarota, I see you laughing. What do you think?
Oh, it's a complicated question. I don't doubt the sincerity, right? I mean, for progressives, they see desperate people fleeing desperate circumstances, and I think that is to their credit, but they do not consider the consequence of saying, well, if you arrive at the border, we'll let you in. If you use this app, we'll let you in. They don't appreciate the impact on American workers or the fiscal impact of doing that, but I do think their motives probably are off it. Now, sometimes you could say, well, maybe it's political, they're hoping for votes. I don't think that's what's happening. I also think that, obviously, corporate America, which is aligned with progressives on this issue, that more immigration is always better, lower wages are better. You know, it's that kind of perspective.
And that's what I can't get my brain wrapped around, that if you were the champion of the working man or the forgotten man, to use a political term, if you were the champion of those people, why in the hell would you flood the nation with competition to those individuals and drive down their wages? We talk about increasing minimum wage laws like it's some lofty idea, but at the end of the day, you're not going to do that if you keep flooding the market with cheap labor, right?
Right. I mean, look, you could make an argument that we need to do more to enforce fair labor standards. That seems like a good idea to me, but it's a little bit of a non sequitur because you're still avoiding the fundamental increase in the supply of workers and this enormous problem of these people who don't show up as unemployed but are working age and doing nothing.
So back home, you've got people that are I would say lower wage labor, right? They might be doing oil changes. They might be doing tire rotations. They may be working at a restaurant. This is the forgotten man, and they're the ones that are asking the question, why am I paying for some of the benefits that these illegal immigrants are receiving? Can you elaborate from the moment that, because I went to the border and I saw it firsthand as well, from the moment they get here, what are the different welfare benefits and aid that are provided, and what's the dollar amounts associated?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have great dollar amounts. Obviously, you have all these immediate and emergency care, whether it's housing or immediate health care, that obviously runs into the millions. immigrants, including illegal immigrants, are not supposed to be using these programs unless they get asylum or they're refugees. Then they get access immediately.
But they're fast-tracking everyone on asylum.
Right. So what happens is, if we look at the actual data, like the survey of income and program participation, and look at non-citizen-headed households, yes, their use rates, over half of them access one of the major welfare programs. But what often happens is they get benefits on behalf of their U.S.-born children, or they fall into one of the other categories. So I don't think it's fair to say that people come for welfare, and yet it is true that, not surprisingly, immigrants with modest levels of education, not because they're lazy, but because they have low incomes, they have U.S.-born children, they make very extensive use of those programs. It's not a conspiracy, they just do. And there's no way to have lots of unskilled immigrants come in and not end up with a significant burden on taxpayers.
Well, and I think that you've been very reasonable today. We don't agree on everything, but I think we can agree that Milton Friedman was probably right when he said that you cannot possibly have an open borders nation and a welfare state.
Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Burleson. I'd like to recognize now Ms. Wild from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I just heard one of the witnesses say that we now have corporate America aligned with progressives on this issue. And the issue, of course, is immigrants working in this country. My reaction to that is, when you get a coalition like that, maybe we in Congress should actually pay attention and come up with a comprehensive immigration reform plan. I would commend to your attention the new Dignity Act, which is a bipartisan bill, which actually would take care of some of the issues that we're talking about here today. But Mr. Costa, I wanted to ask you about the essential work sector. According to a report produced by the Joint Economic Committee, immigrant workers make up a disproportionate percentage of the essential job workforce. In 2020, nearly 70% of all immigrants were employed in that sector. First, can you just give us a description of the types of essential work that immigrants are doing?
Sure, jobs like manufacturing, construction, agriculture, leisure and hospitality, restaurants, really all of the occupations that got so much attention during the pandemic that really were the backbone of society functioning.
And I believe one of the occupations you listed was agriculture, right?
Yes, of course.
Interestingly, I just met with a group of small farmers in the anteroom during this hearing, and clearly they are in need of additional workers. You mentioned a number of other essential areas, and I would like to specifically focus on the child care crisis. In my district, anyway, we have a terrible crisis. And as I often say, sometime in the early 1960s, we stopped having a situation where one parent stayed home with the kids, and where we started having more and more two-parent working families. But we've never, ever in this country done anything to create a cohesive structure for child care for working families. But before I get off too far on the child care area, I would like to hear from you about how you think that immigrant workers might be able to contribute to helping us solve this particular workforce crisis.
Sure, and I will say that the provisions that were in the Build Back Better Act actually made really important investments in childcare, and it's a tragedy that they did not become law. It would have helped so many working families, would have helped so many working parents, and allowed more people to have children if they want to. And I think that immigrants also play an important role in those sectors. Domestic workers, people working in the home, people working in nursing facilities, different home and medical care facilities are in fact immigrants. It's one of the fastest growing occupations. It's where we're going to need workers, so immigrants could really contribute there.
You know, what my colleague who questioned just before me talked about, this is a quote from him, flooding the market with cheap labor. I just want to make it perfectly clear, that's not what I'm advocating for. I'm not suggesting that we bring immigrants here to work and then we pay them substandard wages. But what I am hearing from every employer across my district, essential industries and not, although most of them are, either healthcare, manufacturing facilities, and so forth, is that they simply cannot get enough workers. And so to your colleague's point, what I am seeing is that corporate America is actually aligned with others, and specifically progressives, on this issue. And I see that as a good thing, because it might actually pave the way towards some sort of sensible approach to work visas and making sure that people are able to come here and earn a living and not be dependent on social welfare programs and that kind of thing. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wild. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Banks from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Camerata, you've written at length about the decline in the labor force participation rate among Americans, especially working-aged men. Senator Rubio put out a report just last week that expands on this. In fact, it affirms that the influx of millions of low-skilled immigrants, both illegal and legal, has had an undeniable impact on tens of millions of Americans and their ability to find work. You were cited in the report. Just how badly, can you tell us, have pro-open border lawmakers and politicians like Joe Biden hurt the job prospects of working-aged Americans?
Right. Well, you're fundamentally increasing the supply of workers. If you somehow all of a sudden made them legal, that could be better, right? Then they wouldn't necessarily be as easy to exploit, but you'd still have fundamentally added maybe 10 million people who have no education beyond high school. That has an impact at the bottom end of the labor market. The reason corporate America wants it is they want lower wages. They're happy that if they were all legal. That's not really, they don't want illegality. They'd be happy. And why that's bad is two fundamental reasons. It reduces the job in terms of the wage and benefits it's likely to pay and makes it less attractive. And second, and I would argue this is a more sociological question, again, when we hear that employers are telling congressmen, we can't find any workers, give us more immigrants, what you're not hearing them say is, we need to figure out how to get all these Americans who are not counted as unemployed but are out of the labor force. Obviously, we can't get them all back. There's all kinds of issues going on there. But like I said, if we could just return the labor force participation rate to what it was in 2000, it would add 6 million people to the labor force. And that is a reasonable thing we could try to do. Get back to what it was just 20-some years ago. And immigration is letting us ignore it.
Why is it that the elites, the corporate America, aren't interested in those working class Americans who are who aren't employed? What's their motivation for not leaning in?
It is striking to see progressive organizations cite the unemployment rate and not the massive decline in work for 60 years. It is striking. But in fairness, I mean, the Obama White House put out a good report on this years ago, and others. There's been books. It's not a secret. Senator Rubio has pointed it out. It's well studied. It's very complex what's going on. It's not just simply that wages are too low or that immigrants are displacing natives. It's a much more complex question, but immigration is part of that story, and it's letting us ignore it. And so if you ask me, the number one reason we ignore it as a society is we have the immigrants, and remember, the immigrants are eager to work. Unfortunately, I think we could get a lot of the folks quickly back in, but there's a lot of people that it's going to take effort. Job training, there's some hand-holding, substance abuse treatment, mental health issues. So it's going to be hard, and we're never going to do that if we have access to the immigrants.
What industries have been most affected by the influx of immigrant labor, both legal and illegal?
Well, as I said initially, so it would be like construction labor, building, cleaning, and maintenance, retail sales, food processing, preparation, and food service. These are jobs. Agriculture is also affected, but it often drives the immigration debate. But just to be clear, we think, Pew and myself, we all estimate that less than 5% of illegal immigrants even work in agriculture. In a workforce of over 160 million, it's less than 1% of the total workforce. Only 4% of illegals work there. When you think of illegal immigration, agriculture is not the place to be thinking about it. And if you want, you could tweak the guest worker program, the unlimited guest worker program. We have H-2A, if you think that would be better. But It's mainly in the service sector and some forms of light manufacturing, and that's precisely where less educated, or a large share of less educated Americans work.
According to a Gallup poll earlier this year, the percentage of Democrat voters who said they favor less immigration jumped from virtually non-existent to almost 20% of Democrat voters today, which is a significant shift. Just this week, Eric Adams warned that the influx of economic migrants would, quote, destroy New York City. With that being said, what will having hundreds of thousands of new migrants mean for workers in a big city like New York City?
Well, it means a lot of demand on public services, and it means a lot of people competing in a city where the native-born workforce has a very low, the less educated native-born workforce has a very low labor force participation. It's likely to exacerbate that problem.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. And I'd like to now recognize Ranking Member DeSaulnier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Costa, in 2017, the National Academies released a 642-page paper on immigration in this country. And I wanted you mentioned it in your opening comments. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit more. Before you do, just again, we have an immigration problem in this country. We have gone through this before in our history. But it requires us to work together, Mr. Chairman, and I think I have a deserved reputation of being willing to work with people. Our perspective is that this hearing is surreal. I agree. We need to have a thoughtful immigration policy in this country. Mr. Scott mentioned S 744, the so-called Gang of Eight. Mr. Rubio, Mr. McCain on the Republican side, Durbin and Schumer, leaders on the Senate side. In 2013, it passed the Senate 68-32. We know now that Steve Bannon and others put pressure on the then Speaker, Mr. Boehner, not to have it come to the floor. So we've had other attempts. I remember there have been multiple attempts by Republicans and Democrats to have a thoughtful immigration policy bill come to the floor. But whenever we get to that point, colleagues on the other side, my perspective, don't want to be on the record for a thoughtful compromise approach to this. So, Mr. Costa, with that as just introduction, talk to the National Academy. This is why it's there. This is what it's respected for. What did it say on its analysis?
That study was, it's one of the most seminal studies on the impact of, on the fiscal and economic impact of immigration on the United States. And it did a number of different scenarios looking at how immigration can play out in the economy. And its essential takeaway was that the impact on employment in natives, of U.S.-born, natives is not very much, but that the economy grows, very well, and most workers do just fine in almost all of the scenarios.
And let's speak a little bit about California. We have lots of problems, lots of challenges, but on this, at least my experience again, having been the chair of the Labor Committee in the state Senate, 80% of the members in the California building trades are now minorities and women. They're actively recruiting people who are here legally or are in the process to come into their unions. And coming from the hotel and restaurant business, same thing. I meet with colleagues in that service industry, as others have mentioned, people without a high school degree but no college degree. They're entering that workforce. When I talk to colleagues either in the construction business or in the service industry, like other colleagues here, they say we need a good workforce. We don't have enough. So how do we do this? And I'm reminded of listening to my grandparents in Lowell, Massachusetts, the mostly Irish and the French, talk about the same issues in the early 1900s. If you do what you've always done, you get what you've always got. We're repeating history here. A more thoughtful approach would be, we've got demographic challenges as a country. We need immigrants. We need them here lawfully and thoughtfully. Why wouldn't we work together to do that? So speak a little bit about, at least in the western United States and the West Coast, where we have a lot of immigration, both the successes and challenges.
Sure. As a Californian myself, and there are 10.5 million or so immigrants in California, including 2 of whom are my parents. And they make up about a third of the entire workforce in California, and they work in just about every single industry there. And so, sure, there are challenges. Unauthorized immigrants who are there, who make up about 6 or 7% of the workforce, they, don't have rights in the workplace that they can enforce, and that's a real issue. But there are very easy policy solutions for them, and Congress needs to come together and pass a broad legalization to give rights to the workers who don't have them.
And one of the other witnesses mentioned about lack of enforcement. That's not my experience as an employer. I know one of our former colleagues from California, Mimi Walters, we worked on this a lot about the underground economy and enforcement, both in mostly in California, for employers who are actually doing the right thing and making sure people are here legally. Could you speak to that briefly? That's not our experience in California. We enforce the law.
The Division of Labor Standards Enforcement in California is probably one of the best labor standards enforcement agencies in the country. That's true. They are also underfunded and understaffed. And I will say not every employer is a bad employer, but there needs to be a system in place for enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to our ranking member, and I now recognize Chairwoman Fox for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, there's a fentanyl epidemic in our country. In 2022 alone, the Drug Enforcement Administration seized enough fentanyl to kill almost 400 people. For working-age Americans, fentanyl overdose is the leading cause of death. Fentanyl has not only had a devastating impact on our society, but also on our workforce. In your written testimony, you said that between 2013 and 2021, opioid use accounted for the loss of more than 1.3 million workers. Could you discuss the impact that synthetic opioids like fentanyl have had on working-age Americans and the American workforce as a whole? But keep in mind, I only have 5 minutes.
I will be brief. Since 2013, we've seen overdoses go up by about 200%, and this is the leading cause of death, as you mentioned, for some prime-age workers. That has contributed to the labor force participation rate going down, particularly through the pandemic. We saw a sharp spike in the synthetic opioids, fentanyl in particular.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Law, in your written testimony, you highlighted that the Biden administration inherited a secure border. Yet in President Biden's tenure, more than 5 million illegal aliens, and that's the appropriate term to use, have been apprehended crossing the southern border, with approximately 3 million of them being released into American communities. Additionally, an estimated 2 million gotaways, bypass Border Patrol agents, have made it into the country. How have the Biden administration's border and immigration policies put Americans last and fuel this catastrophe?
Well, thank you. Again, the complete lack of deterrence, the ending of the migrant protection protocols in particular, which required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico until their immigration court dates. Our immigration laws are very clear. You can either be detained or you may wait in Mexico until your immigration court date. This administration has ended that policy and allowed millions of illegal aliens into this country, and now they have undergone an unprecedented campaign to get them work permits and into the labor market. I think there's been an interesting shift in the conversation here on the other side of the aisle, conflating legal immigration with illegal immigration, and what we're talking about today is the fact that every illegal alien who's in this country is someone who should not be here because they're in violation of our laws, and they should not be in the workforce, and that is a potential job that an American worker could have.
Thank you very much. Dr. Camerata, in your written testimony, you noted that the labor force participation rate of working-age Americans has reached historic lows, and that this rate tended to decline the most among the least educated. Without work, these individuals tend to have higher rates of substance abuse, welfare dependency, crime, and even early death. Can you discuss how the influx of illegal aliens across the southern border has made this pressing societal issue easier to ignore?
Right. So we need workers, right? We know the unemployment rate is low, and we're talking about the bottom end of the labor market here. Let's not discuss immigration generally. We're talking about illegal immigration. And employers want workers, right? But what we keep hearing is they keep saying to congressmen and their elected leaders, give us more immigrants, and not, hey, we need to get a lot more of these folks who used to be in the labor market back into the labor force. And what immigration does is it shifts the debate. Instead of trying to improve the lives of all these people on the economic sidelines, which is not necessarily easy all the time, it takes a lot of effort. Partnership, state and local, federal and public-private. It's a big issue, but we're not doing it because we have access to so much immigrant labor, and illegal immigration just adds to that. And so I doubt that we'll ever deal with it unless we actually enforce our laws and then force the business community and to address this problem. And as you say, it's clearly a problem. We know it's linked to all these social pathologies that you mentioned.
Thank you. I will say again what Republicans have said over and over and over again. We cannot talk about a, quote, comprehensive, end quote, immigration policy and overall until the border is shut down. That is the key to everything that we need to be doing. We need to close the border and make sure that that's done before we do anything else. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Law, in your testimony, you mentioned the Biden administration's decision to issue EADs, or employment authorization documents, to millions of illegal aliens. In order to mask the true invasion numbers, Secretary Mayorkas is misusing his parole authority, which is supposed to be offered to illegal aliens on a case-by-case basis, but instead the Biden DHS is releasing entire groups of illegal Americans into the country on parole, which removes wait times from asylum laws and instead immediately makes these illegal aliens eligible to work legally. Is that an accurate reflection of your testimony, your understanding of the situation?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Largely so. I would add the qualifier with parole that it's not just a case-by-case basis, but it must be for either an urgent humanitarian reason or a significant public benefit. The lack of detention space or the fact that somebody wants to come here but doesn't qualify for a visa meets neither one of those criteria as well.
Yeah, I would point out that it's not really a question of not having laws. It's our laws not being followed, as you know. So EADs can be issued to all aliens who request asylum in the U.S. pending the review of their asylum claims. And it's my understanding the federal government continues issuing EADs to aliens after they've been issued final orders of removal. So in other words, even after a federal immigration judge has found that an illegal alien is in the United States, again illegally, and orders him to leave, that alien can still get an EAD and keep working. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. That is one of the work permit categories that, and then of course the notion of giving someone with an order of supervision, which means they've already received a final order of removal. They've exhausted all avenues of attempt to stay in this country, and this is it. But if you give them a work permit, they're not going to cooperate with getting their visa. They're not going to cooperate with their home country. And I believe we're approaching pretty close to 2 million illegal aliens with final orders of removal that remain in the country.
There's nearly 2 million. So there's nearly 2 million illegal aliens in the country who've been literally ordered to be removed by a federal immigration judge, but they're still authorized to work by Joe Biden's Department of Homeland Security. Right?
I believe that's the approximate number. It might be, it's hard to tell. This administration that promised to be the most transparent has gone out of their way to hide the work permit data that the Department of Homeland Security keeps track of. But there's over 1 million that they inherited through the difficulties that the sanctuary city states like California impeded President Trump's ability to deport illegal aliens. And it's only grown from there because this administration's not removing anybody.
And you would agree that if an illegal is here, but they've got that piece of paper from the government that lets them work legally, they're unlikely to ever leave.
That's absolutely correct.
Jumping to Dr. Camarada, I wanted to ask you a question with respect to, you conducted a report that showed that median weekly earnings for U.S.-born workers without a bachelor's degree increases more during periods of lower immigration than in periods of higher immigration. Can you discuss a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the period 2017, 18, and 19 is interesting because it's a strong economy, and yet the level of immigration actually fell. We don't find that at any other time in the data. Usually immigration goes up when the economy is strong. So some of it seems to have been a reduction in illegal immigration, and some of it seems to be a reduction in legal immigration. It's hard to parse out exactly. Looks like it's both. But that decline in overall immigration was a period of higher wage growth for Americans without a college degree. And it grew much faster than in the 4 and 5 years before that, when the immigration level was higher, even though the economy was also expanding at that time. Interestingly enough, another paper in Economic Review recently comes to pretty much the same conclusion. They look at areas that had traditionally been getting a lot of immigrants in the earlier period. Then when there was the slowdown, 2017 to 19, in those high immigration areas where they got less people, wages seem to have done much better. And I also found that labor force participation improved during that period when immigration was lower. So it's kind of a real world test. And the test seems to show that less immigration is good, at least for the less educated in the United States.
Well, I would just add a comment from some of what's been said in the hearing. My friends on the other side often want to conflate immigration with the illegal border invasion, and they want to suggest if you criticize the invasion, then you are somehow against immigration, when we're the most generous country in the world, historically and currently, where we allow some 1 million legal immigrants into our country. As Mr. Costa has pointed out, we are a nation of immigrants. We've got many millions of immigrants in our country, and just because you believe that we should control whom we allow into our country and ought to happen lawfully does not mean you're against immigration or merit-based immigration. With that, that concludes our time of questioning our witnesses, and I'd like to recognize. Thank you very much. Mr. Grothman has slipped in while I was talking. I'd like to recognize my good friend, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. We're going to work our way for a question for Mr. Law, but we'll give a kind of a build-up to the question. Earlier this year on my subcommittee regarding oversight, at the time we learned the Biden administration had lost contact with almost 100,000 unaccompanied minors. However, the director of Office of Refugee Resettlement didn't seem to know that. A shocking number of these children appear to be exploited by their sponsors, and they're forced to work to pay debts to their sponsors. I'm concerned the Biden administration is failing this vulnerable population. I mean, if a minor comes across the border and they're unaccompanied by anybody, that should be a real danger sign in the first place. But it appears that they've waived background checks and addressed verification requirements for potential sponsors. Similarly, the Office of Homeland Security has ended familial DNA testing at the southern border. I don't know why you do that. Further reports show Secretary Becerra personally pushed for faster processing and discharging of unaccompanied minors to the detriment of the children's safety, pressuring staff at ORR to treat UAS processing like a factory. The Secretary was quoted as saying, if Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line. When asked about those comments, an HHS spokesman stated he wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Mr. Law, do you believe the administration's policies, such as those I described, have created a humanitarian crisis among minors coming across our southern border?
Thank you. So I would say it's not just isolated to the minors. It's everyone. There's not a single illegal alien that makes it across the southern border without having to pay debts to the cartels and human traffickers. The exploitation begins the moment they get into that connection. It goes throughout the entire journey. And in many cases, like especially with the unaccompanied alien children, the exploitation continues once this administration quickly releases them to their traffickers.
So in other words, if a 15-year-old crosses the southern border, how much you think they're on the hook for with the cartels, you think?
My understanding, it varies depending on what part of the world you are from. But at the end of the day, most of these people are coming from far poorer countries in the United States, and these debts are, in the $5,000 to $20,000 range, money that they do not have, and the only way that you pay that back is through, sex slavery, worker, indentured servitude, things of that nature. It's really horrific.
Caseworkers at Office of Refugee Resettlement claim HHS regularly ignored obvious signs of labor exploitation, including red flags such as single sponsors sponsoring multiple UACs, hotspots in the country where most unaccompanied minor sponsors are not the children's parents, and even direct reports of trafficking. Do you believe, Mr. Law, that HHS and ORR turned a blind eye to signs of unaccompanied minor exploitation to to maintain good optics for their agencies?
Well, having not been there, it's hard to know if they're turning a blind eye, but one thing that is absolutely clear is that the sheer volume is unsustainable. This is an administration that is trying to process and manage its way through the border crisis it created, and you just cannot do it. And so whether they're turning a blind eye intentionally or just the fact that they are overwhelmed, at the end of the day, they are streamlining the release of unaccompanied alien children to unvetted sponsors, and frankly, that seems to be a highly irresponsible decision.
This is exponentially higher than it was 2 years at this time. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Do you believe their policies are what's causing so many people to come here, including so many minors to come here?
Well, of course, open borders is a great business model for the cartels and the traffickers, which is why human smuggling and trafficking has turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry. As I've mentioned repeatedly, there are no enforcement policies on the books. All they're doing is trying to funnel illegal immigration to the ports of entry, claiming that that's lawful. It's not. And then they're trying to hide those who would otherwise across the border by paroling them, which basically means if you have an international airport, you're a border state because they're just being flown in.
I'll ask you, how do these people find out about it? Okay, if I'm in Bangladesh, if I'm in Nigeria, how would I find out that the U.S. border is essentially open?
A combination of things. Those who came before you successfully got in, have been released quickly, have reunited with other family members, working, et cetera. And then the cartels, they're highly sophisticated, they're well aware of the policies. That's why you saw a slight blip in border crossings after Title 42 ended. Even their blip was the worst recorded times. And then they saw, no, there's actually no enforcement.
Are they advertising for people to come here illegally around the world?
The cartels, absolutely, and they are using a lot of the social media platforms to do so.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Grothman. And now I'd like to recognize Ranking Member DeSaulnier for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Before I close, I'd like to insert a statement from the AFL-CIO into the record that offers real solutions to the issues impacting today's workers. That's the AFL-CIO, people who protect American workers. Also want to mention that we have asked for a hearing on child labor and the issues surrounding that. Colleague Alma Adams has written a letter to the chair, so I'd like to mention that as well, and hopefully we could have a response to that. Would also just a moment to recognize tragedy last night for someone who used to be on this committee, Alaska Representative Mary Politola, who tragically lost her husband last evening in an airplane crash. So I want to mention that. I forgot to mention it in my opening comments. Mr. Chairman, this is unquestionably an issue that needs to be addressed by the Congress. My reading of American history and immigration is it was not a perfect situation at any moment. It evolved over time. We were a country that was formed on freedom and cheap labor. Some of that aspirational, some of that part of our national history that's not something that any of us are proud of in many instances. The issue that has been brought up about conflating legal versus illegal, I think that's part of as I listen to that, Mr. Law, Mr. Chairman, that's a fair assessment in so much as they are interrelated from my perspective. How do we deal with the issue of aging and demographic changes in this country and a robust workforce that benefits everybody? Other industrialized countries struggle with this, the Japanese foremost, and a lot of the EU. So how do we do it in a thoughtful way that's based on research like the National Academy so that we can address these issues in a way that in the long term benefits this country? Reminded of the early 1900s when we established the first immigration, sort of, to stop Eastern Europeans after the flux of immigrants of the Irish and then the Italians and the Eastern Europeans, that people would pay to get on ships. They'd get to New York or Boston, and if the ships had already come in and the quota was met, they were sent back. So just as a thoughtful process, let's acknowledge that we have a difference of opinion and perspectives. There are people who want to utilize that for their own reasons. That my perspective is it's based on a lot of race-based subjective opinions. Again, not unusual in this country. But we've overcome that when we've come together and tried to be analytical about what benefits this country in total. So with that, I'd offer that when it comes to the workforce, I think there's an opportunity, hopefully, sooner rather than later, to go back to where we meet, as the Senate did in 2013, and had a comprehensive, real-world, thoughtful analysis where Republicans and Democrats got together, and that maybe both houses wouldn't be frightened by independent expenditures that misrepresent what individual members of Congress did when they voted and participated in that effort. So with that, I'd just like to remind people who may be listening that members on this side of the aisle have laid out a legislative agenda that puts the workers and families first in the United States. Congressional Democrats have proposed bills that put more money in workers' pockets, protect workers on the job, and penalize low-road employers for engaging in exploiting child labor practices and exploiting our workforce. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, and without objection, your request is approved, and thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier, for your comments. Thank you, everybody, for participating in what is a very important issue addressing some of the impacts of what is one of the most important crises facing America, Biden's open border crisis. We may all sympathize with individuals who are desiring to come to America in search of economic opportunity, in search of a better life. However, we are a nation of laws, and without laws being followed, we have the anarchy that is on display at our southern border. Secretary Mayorkas says the border is under control, and it is under control, but unfortunately and sadly and dangerously, it's under control by the Mexican crime cartels. Echoing the sentiments of some of the members who spoke today, it's baffling to understand, quite frankly, the perspective of the other side. In addition to the strain and the stress placed on border residents, I've been to the border 5 times in the last 2.5 years to see it for myself. The strain and the stress on border states who are bearing the brunt of the situation, local law enforcement, along with law enforcement even in my community in Virginia, hundreds of miles from the border. The strain and the stress on our social services, our healthcare systems, our education systems, not to mention the explosion of drugs pouring across our border and the resulting overdose deaths in our country, some 100,000 a year. Then there's the $150 billion cost for a nation that is bankrupting itself with its spending and borrowing some $2 trillion a year currently. But I would further just ask, with the open border situation, what about the 1.5 million gotaways over the last 2.5 years who aren't surrendering to Border Patrol, aren't using the CBP One app, they aren't taking advantage of all that's offered to illegals by this administration, but they wear the carpet shoes and the camo head to toe. They're trafficking things across our border. They've got the criminal ties, terrorist ties, and so forth. What is the national security impact of that? How could any member of Congress defend that? Would someone take the bet that 90% of those are here for just a better life? And then there's only 10% that wish us harm, 150,000? Or maybe you really think that 99% are here just for a better life of the gotaways, the ones who evade apprehension at the border. That would be 15,000. And one of our colleagues, I believe as Mrs. Hayes pointed out, the perpetrators of 9/11 referenced them, 19 which did that. If 99% of the criminal gotaways are wonderful individuals seeking a better life, that would be 15,000. What kind of harm could they do? I would submit irreparable harm has been done to this country that will only be revealed in the future with what has happened so far. I want to read the words of New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who last week at a town hall he spoke about the unprecedented number of illegal aliens that are pouring into his city, which pales into comparison, again, what's happening in the border states. course, you could say that every state's a border state. My sheriffs, my local law enforcement in my district in Virginia would say that they feel like a border state. But Eric Adams, mayor of New York, said, I'm going to tell you something, New Yorkers, never in my life have I had a problem that I didn't see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. 110,000 migrants we have to feed, clothe, house, educate the children, wash their laundry sheets, give them everything they need, health care. It's going to come through your neighborhoods. All of us are going to be impacted by this. I said it last year when we had 15,000, and I'm telling you now with 110,000, the city we knew we're about to lose. End quote. That's the mayor of New York City, located some over 1,000 miles away from the border. And I'm concerned that New York City is a case study for the country. He's expressing what many feel. So I would like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and for your participation for this subcommittee. And without further objection or further business, this subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.